I just want to preface it a little bit with how I've been preaching for years and years for the use of body cameras because I know they're expensive, but they are a lot less expensive than hiring a lawyer. And often what they capture is very helpful and can prevent things from even getting to a litigation point. There are, however, as I've seen over the last 7 years working with body cameras and dash cameras, starting out really with dash cameras and now with body cameras, there is a false sense sometimes of security that an officer doesn't need to write a good report because everything is captured on camera. And it's very important for us to remember that the camera is one tool, but it doesn't capture everything that an officer is seeing and feeling and experiencing in terms of emotion, subtle cues, and often can be blocked during a confrontation, whether there's a scuffle or not. Someone can be in between the camera and what's going on, or the camera might not be able to catch something because of quick movements or the way that it's positioned. And so it's really, really important and absolutely crucial that we have these good reports to supplement. Well, and I don't want to use the word for supplement. Report writing really is the primary means of conveying what occurred, how it occurred, and why it occurred. The body cameras and dash cameras and any other types of recordings by citizens are merely additional tools. So it's with that backdrop that the report writing, the importance of report writing that we're going to talk about today begins. So one of the things that we have told people throughout the years is to ensure that there aren't a lot of editorials in police reports. We want really what the facts are primarily. And those are things that are going to be critical in helping a judge or a jury determine whether what happened is appropriate. So first, you start at the beginning. And it's really important to detail what information was given to the officers. And that's often going to be provided by dispatch. It may be provided by citizens on the street. So, and it may also be included by what the officer observed that resulted in the interaction with the suspect. So it's really important to start the story where it begins and to help the reader, who will be the attorneys and the judges and the juries, to determine what got the officer to where the officer was in the first place. So in addressing those issues, what we want to do is focus in on facts as opposed to conclusions. And this is something that lawyers really struggle with. I remember when I was clerking for federal Judge Dee Benson, we talked extensively about how lawyers struggle differentiating between facts and conclusions. And conclusions are things that are based on facts. I was nervous. The suspect was acting suspicious. And those are really important to have because they help people understand why the officer did what he or she did. But it's crucial to know what facts support those. When a judge is looking at a motion for summary judgment, whether being able to dismiss a claim without having to go to trial, it's not enough to just include conclusions. The attorneys have to be able to present facts to the judge that allow the judge to reach certain conclusions and that it can be no other conclusion. So you want to detail things, what happened. And really the most effective way to do that is to do that using an active voice. Sometimes passive voice is appropriate, but it's much more interesting for people to listen to, and it puts the person in the officer's shoes a lot better if you use an active voice. So instead of something like it was observed that the suspect was carrying a weapon concealed in her waistband, it's much more interesting and forceful if the officer says, I saw the suspect with a handgun in the waistband. So that's using the active voice, and it just helps put the person who's reviewing the information in the shoes of the officer a lot better. And that's what we want to do, is to have the person making the decision stand in those shoes so that they can know why the officer did what he or she did. And then, in addition to using the active voice, it's really important to provide detail about what occurred. If you've met with me on cases, I'll often tell people that the devil is in the details. And that's why we attorneys ask so many different questions, because some people will have certain biases, and I don't mean biases in a negative way. We all have experiences and viewpoints based on what we have gone through in our lives. And so it's important to include details so that the person can take the information, the facts that are provided, and reach that conclusion that you want to do. So what we want to do often is to describe things in addition to not just what happened, but really how and why we did it. And one of the things that I like to do when I have an officer on the stand is to detail what the officer's training has been, so that the jurors will understand how the officer was trained and that the officer was acting in accordance with his or her training. That always gives them a greater deal of comfort, because there are a lot of police tactics that people don't understand. And when we explain the training and why we're trained to do certain things, it really, a light bulb will go off, and it helps them to stand again in the officer's shoes and understand what the officers did. The other thing that was really helpful is to provide background on the officer's experiences that the officer has had in the past. There may be instances where an officer has been involved in a certain situation, such as where a suspect is going to flee, and recognizes certain body language that might not be captured on a camera because it's too far away, or it doesn't capture that feeling, that sixth sense that you develop through the experiences that you have. And so it can be very helpful to include past experiences that you don't want to go into detail about the past experiences. But, for example, instead of just saying the subject made a furtive movement, that is really both conclusory, and it doesn't really explain how it is you got to see what you're doing. If you explain, you've been in a situation before where there's been a robbery and you noticed how people were acting, it's things such as glancing at the clerk in the store and glancing back at other people who are standing nearby. Those are the things that make you suspicious. Perhaps there's a person out in a running car in front of the store as well. There might be another person that the individual came into the store with, but they separate and remain separated for some period of time. So those kinds of things, those details, really help explain why it is that the suspect appeared suspicious, and helps the judge and the jury reach the very same conclusion that the officer reached. One of the things that is important too, particularly, is where any force is used. And that's where you really want to focus in on writing a good and thorough report, because it may not seem at the time that something may turn south into a lawsuit. But what we want to do is prevent any indication that later on, or any accusation later on, that an officer is changing a report or didn't include it because it didn't happen. And where we have uses of force and good detailed reports are provided up front, it helps protect the officer and the department and the employing entity into the future. So we don't want to hide the fact that any force was used. We want to be very upfront about what happened. We do want to, so we don't want to gloss over it. We want to address it. It's always best if we can address things head on. But we also don't want to, we need to be very careful about the words that we use. It's important as you write the reports to think about what others, you know what you mean, but if you sit back and look at it, try to look at it from someone else's perspective who is not in a law enforcement capacity. I know when I prepare an opening statement for trial, one of the first people that I practice that on is my mom, because she's going to be approaching it like the jury is, and then she will provide me feedback and questions that will help me do a good job. And I'm not saying have other, lay people review your reports, but try to view it in a way that, with the eyes that a non-officer might be reading it. One of the other things that we want to make sure that we include are injuries that they complained of, that you noticed, and then detail that there were no other injuries that were complained of. Or if there were no injuries at all, that you asked the subject if he or she was injured or in any pain, and they said no, that you offered medical assistance and they declined that. Those can be very powerful things because those are done at the moment before people have the time to think about and lawsuits and hire attorneys and change stories to fit their goals of succeeding in litigation. So detailing those things can be really important and particularly helpful if you have a body camera. You can certainly, make sure, if you can, that the body camera captures what the person looks like close up. But you also might consider taking some still photographs. If they say, my hand hurts, take a photograph of the hand. I was in a deposition a couple of weeks ago with a woman who claimed that her left eye had been injured and that she was disfigured and was horribly embarrassed about going out. And as I was sitting across the table from her, looking at her face and how it moved, and I couldn't see anything wrong with it. And so what a person may perceive can be very, very different than what really is shown. So those photographs and those videos of, say, for example, how the person is walking. If you have someone who later claims that their leg was injured or their knee was injured or blown out as a result, if you see them walking around just fine at the scene, those photographs can be very, very helpful. So make sure you do that and include those with your report, a reference to them in the report, and include them as part of the report. Let's move on to the next thing that is really helpful. And this goes into the flavor, I like to call it. And here's where, so we tell them what happened, and then we want to tell them a little bit about what it was like to be in that situation, so it's easier for them to step into your shoes. An example that I have outlined is, often I'll see in police reports, I was concerned for my safety, which is indeed true. But that is pretty sterile. What we want to do is bring the words out that will evoke the feelings that it was like to feel concerned for your safety. So what you want to do is explain what things looked like, who was there, what the lighting was like. And I had an interesting argument with a judge many years ago talking about a SWAT operation, and there was a no-knock entry warrant that allowed, of course, the officers to break down the door, which they did do on entry. And the judge was very flippant about why the officers needed this no-knock warrant. And he said, how do they know it wasn't Mother Teresa on the other side? And I responded to him, well, how did we know it wasn't Ma Barker on the other side? And then I went through and relayed the specific information that was provided by the officers in the report about the facts supporting the no-knock entry, that it was a known drug house, that it was frequented by gang members, that there had been previous shootings at the house, that there were people who would go in and out of the house in very short periods of time. And so that helped set the scene about what it was like to be there. It's also important, you know, for the fact finders to be able to understand, not that bad things don't happen at a church at, you know, 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning. We've seen that happen. But it paints an entirely different picture where an officer is called to a very chaotic fight at a bar where people have been drinking and it's 3 o'clock in the morning. So to include those details, they're very helpful. And again, they provide the context for what the officer is doing and why the officer is taking those actions. The next thing that we can do to help them understand what it was like to be there is to explain what it was that caused the officer to feel the way the officer did. And those things are really important, such as what the suspect was doing. I know it's preaching to the choir to talk about demeanor, because demeanor, the way that someone is talking to an officer, is absolutely crucial. I know that it plays into the decisions that the officers make. And so to include specifics about the suspect's demeanor can be very helpful. Body language, I mean, is the person standing calmly with his or her arms to the side, hands visible, or is the person nervously moving, shuffling his or her feet, sort of turning, looking around, again, fidgeting with the waistband or at a pocket area? Those things are really helpful to understand, and they're the things that play into the decisions that you make based on training. And I think tone of voice is really critical. I don't see a lot in reports about tone of voice, but if some, you know, people may say that the suspect was cooperative or was not cooperative. But what does that mean? How were they being cooperative? And tone of voice can be very helpful in determining those are just a couple of examples, but any of the things that you notice and that you remember, write those down and include them. It won't hurt you to include those details. One of the other things that I think is important is to document the scene and the suspect, because whenever a suspect comes into court, they are not going to look the way they did the night or the day or whenever it was you encountered them. And it's really helpful, again, those photographs and those body cameras that can detail that, but also include those details in the report if possible. If you've looked at a photo or seen the body camera and it looks like it details everything, there's perhaps no reason to include that in the report. But there may be certain details about what a person looked like that can be very helpful. Maybe there's a tattoo or that means a certain thing, or there are cuts or bruising that is consistent with being in a violent situation. So those can be very helpful. And it helps the fact finder, whether it's a judge or a jury, to see the person that you saw or that the officer saw that when the officer was interacting them, not just what they look like in a very nice, quiet, peaceful courtroom. And another thing that we don't always remember is it can be important to detail what the officer looked like. Sometimes people will claim they didn't know an officer was an officer. You know, if it's like an undercover officer and there's a badge that the officer is saying that they showed, where was that badge and how was it shown and what did it look like? Or was the officer dressed in a full uniform with a car that was fully marked and had lights and sirens? I use those examples in court all the time and blow those up and put them on the screen. Even when there aren't claims that the person didn't know there was an officer, just so the jury can see what it was like that time. So just one example, a photo in the officer's uniform can show a lot of things. We've heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And it can, I know when I see officers come into my office, they look very differently than they do in their uniforms. And there's something commanding about an officer in a uniform that can lend to the importance of when an order is made and a person complies or does not comply with that. The next thing I want to move to is sort of how you say things. So I am a big critic of police speak. When you listen to things like Dragnet and you hear that tone of voice or the certain key phrases that you hear often on the news, I think it makes officers sound mechanical. And if there's anything we want to convey, is that officers are human beings and they are perceiving things in a very human way. So one of the ways that we can avoid having them appear mechanical is to make sure that the language in a report is not mechanical as well. An example here, I've written down, I observed the subject vehicle driving in excess of the posted speed limit. That's not how people talk. People say, I saw the red car driving approximately 50 miles an hour in a 30 mile per hour zone. You know, I turned on my lights and the driver pulled over and I got out of my car and walked to the driver's side door. It's more concise. It goes to that active voice that we were talking about before, it pulls the person into the officer's shoes more, and it makes them sound more relatable than the example above. So try to get in the habit of just talking like an everyday human being. Lawyers have the worst problem with trying to sound like lawyers. It's, when they talk to their clients, they say, well, we're looking at whether there are disputed facts that will prevent granting of a motion for summary judgment, and whether the officer acts reasonably under the totality of the circumstances. What did they just say? And I'm actually serving as the chair of the Civil Rights Jury Instructions for Utah courts. And one of our goals in preparing those civil rights jury instructions is to make them plain language. So, we just want people to sound normal. So like a lawyer would say, instead of that summary judgment, is we're looking at a way to try to get the case thrown out of court without having to go to a trial. Now, everyone understands that. And so be thinking of ways that you can say things in that normal layperson that will make you more relatable to them, because not only will they be able to understand it, but there won't be that barrier, that language barrier between you. One of the next things that is really important is proofreading. It shouldn't be because you're busy, but it is really important that things don't have spelling errors to the extent possible. Now, we all make mistakes, and I have grammatical and spelling errors that get by me sometimes. But the fewer that there are, the better off we all are. If there is a report that contains grammar that is awkward, numerous spelling errors, it really decreases the credibility that an officer has with jurors. It may seem petty, whether it is or is not. It's how people perceive things. And the cleaner and more professional things look, the more credibility an officer is going to have. One thing that I was taught by my mentor early on, and that I try to teach my children as we're talking about things, is never overstate the facts. I had a conversation with my son about this just the other day, about how people tend to exaggerate facts that are favorable to them and not acknowledge things that harm them. And that decreases credibility as well. My younger son is an absolute genius. He just came that way when it comes to dealing with confrontation with people, i.e. me. The kid knows that when I'm upset, it doesn't do any good to argue with me. He just says, I'm sorry, Mom, I shouldn't have done that. And he's completely disarmed me. And then we talk, and it's gotten him out of a lot of trouble. And so instead of arguing with me at that point, he just acknowledges something, and then maybe we'll bring it up later, what I could have done better. It's not entirely on point, but it does go to not ever sort of overstating one's position. One of the ways we can accomplish that is to leave out adjectives, and I was taught to do that in writing with the court. Things such as very, extremely, clearly, obviously, there can be no other conclusion, may be offensive to the person who's reading it or to the jury who's being presented with that police report, because they may not see it that way. There are, at times, it can be appropriate to use them. So by not overly using them, when you do include, I was extremely nervous for my safety, and then back it up with facts, there is that more of a level of credibility. And then one of the things that I think applies both to lawyers in their writings to the court and to police officers is don't try to convince people of your position. Let the facts do it. As we write things to the court, the older I get and the more experience I have, the more I focus in on what the facts are. And I think that is, and where I'm going to get the facts is from your reports and from your testimonies. The facts can persuade better than anything else, because what it does is it doesn't impose your beliefs or viewpoints on others. They're simply the facts. And then people, they can be very persuasive if they are presented in a right way. It's all about how you present them. So my advice to you is include the facts. Don't exaggerate. Let the facts help convince the person that you did the right thing when you did it. All right, I want to talk now a little bit about recordings. There are all sorts of recordings that we have the ability and that are out there now. In fact, my friend Ken Wallentine says that he cautions officers when he's talking with them, assume that you are being recorded, because most likely you are. Whether it's by, we have audio recordings now, dash camera videos, body camera videos, we have people with cell phones that are recording things, we have store surveillance videos, they're everywhere. So it's really important to gather all of that information that we have. If you're talking with someone and they're on a DUI and they're slurring their words, what can be more convincing than an actual recording that shows how they sound? Or on the walk and turn test, if they are falling all over the place, video recording of what they were doing. So think about that and how to use that. And as I mentioned earlier, make sure that you reference in your report and book it into evidence. And then one of the things I think it's really helpful is to use the arrestees or the suspect's own actions in words. If they say very derogatory things, if you can put those in quotes and put them in there, it can be very helpful. I have a case where, fortunately, we have a dash camera recording of a gentleman who is just struggles to understand reality. And his version of events was extremely different from what the officers told us. And when we pulled up the video recording and had that, we presented it to the case. And the court concluded that while he claimed certain things happened, the video camera clearly shows that they did not, or that the officers did do certain things that they were supposed to, that supported them. And we were able to obtain a summary judgment on that. So it can be very, very helpful to have that stuff in there. And if there is a quote, I would caution you to make sure that that quote you've reviewed. If there's video camera of it, review it to make sure that that quote is accurate, because it would be very detrimental to say that a person said one thing and then have it come out a different way on the video camera. And then the last thing we've already talked about is just assume that people are recording you. I want to talk next a little bit about supplements. Sometimes officers are concerned about preparing supplements because there is that old adage that if it's not in the report, it didn't happen. But we are human beings, and there are going to be times when we're going to remember things after the fact. It never fails that I'll have an oral argument at a court where I'll think of something after that I wish I would have said. And I don't have the ability to go back and do that. But if it's truly important, I can submit a supplemental memorandum and ask for the court to review that. Oftentimes it's maybe already in the brief and it wasn't something I raised in my argument, but it's there. If there is something in your report that you remember happening a day down the road or a week down the road or even a month down the road, and you remember it happening, prepare that and include it. It's far, even though it occurred after the fact, the best time to do it is before there has been some type of a claim made, because then it shows that there was no bias or other motivation for providing that other than to document what happened. I had an officer one time tell me, why can't officers just be very professional? Don't be a jerk. He used different words than that. But, you know, I had an instance where I was pulled over by an officer, and I should have been. I ran a red light. I tried to beat a red light, and I was on Foothill Boulevard where there was no shoulder, and it was very busy in the morning for University of Utah traffic. And so I wanted to pull out of the way where it would be dangerous for the officer. So I turned on my hazards and slowed down and continued to drive, and drove a point probably about a quarter of a mile to the first street that I could pull up. And I wanted to do that for my safety and for the officer's safety, because I've seen instances where officers have been hit or nearly hit. And so when the officer got out, he came up to my window and he was a real jerk to me about it. He argued with me, and he asked, you know, he yelled at me for doing that, and I tried to explain to him why I did that, and I apologized, but, you know, explained what it was. And I was really irritated, and it escalated the situation. I didn't yell at him, but I sure wanted to. I wanted to grab him by the earlobe and say, you know, you don't have to be rude. Just listen to what people are saying. You know, don't argue with them. Don't be sarcastic. Treat them the way that they would want to be treated. And so, and that was my example of the recent traffic ticket. I had another one that occurred. I know, it was awful. I was speeding like 2 months later and got pulled over close to my house. I was on my way home from the gym. And that officer was really, really nice to me. And he still gave me a ticket. I didn't, you know, ask to get out of the ticket, and he wasn't going to volunteer to let me out. I deserved it. But he just explained to me nicely why he pulled me over. He even empathized with me. You must be in a hurry to get somewhere. And it really calmed the situation down. And he was a good example of someone that created a situation that was a much more positive experience. Even though I had the ticket, I couldn't be mad at the guy. So those are things I think that are really important that you remember and help. What I wanted to move on next to is sort of how those reports can move now into depositions, or you can include trial testimony and how they're used. So let's talk a little bit about that. A deposition, a lot of people might not even know what it is, and a deposition occurs in civil cases where an officer's conduct is called into question. And they're put under oath, and it's the one opportunity that the other side gets to talk to the officer about what they did. And inevitably, they will have that police report that is prepared that they will use to examine the officer. And they will go through a period that the officer will receive instructions about what to do, both at the deposition but in meeting with the officer's attorney prior to. And I have 2 rules in my deposition. I've distilled them down to my preparation instructions down to two things. And absolutely the most important, and if I even had to distill it down to one rule, it would be to tell the truth. When you tell the truth, even if it can be harmful to you, you won't get into more trouble. You usually won't get into trouble. It's the cover-up that is always worse than the crime. So that applies to, as I was talking before, to police reports as well. And when maybe there has been something that an officer has made a mistake and seen that after things happen so quickly with suspects, perhaps acknowledging that something occurred, or that we accidentally entered the wrong house, and then explain why that occurred. The next thing for depositions that's really important is, and it goes to the second rule, is to listen to the question and to make sure that you understand it. We never want people to guess about what their testimony is. And whether you're testifying in court or during a deposition, really it's important to know that you're being asked the question based upon your personal knowledge. So if it's something that you've heard from someone else or that you don't have the basis of the knowledge for it, then your best answer is, I don't know. And it'll get you out of the deposition faster, that's for sure. If you do know, though, it goes back to the first rule, and that's always tell the truth. So, but it's important to slow down. We talk over people in normal conversation, but it's important in deposition and court testimony and relaying information to judges and juries to listen to what the question is and to be responsive to it. And it's okay if you don't understand what the question is. All you have to do is to ask that it be repeated. The next thing that you really want to do goes to think about your answer, and it goes to report writing too. Think about what you're about to write and how someone might view what you're doing. Think about it. It's not a race that we're trying to get through things quickly. It's far more important to be accurate and thoughtful, and to be careful and to take it seriously, not to be flippant about it. And the same applies to depositions as to report writing that we discussed earlier, is respond very precisely, very cleanly, and very directly. So I think as you get in the habit of preparing your reports in a certain way and talking in a certain way in reports, the deposition will and testimony in court will come a little bit more naturally, and it'll be easier for you to go through those. Again, for depositions, the same rule applies as to reports. It's not your job to persuade the other side that what you did is right and what they did was wrong. No one's ever going to do that. Your job is to just help people to understand what you did and why you did it. And that applies to both reports and a deposition. And we do that through the facts. The next one goes to this do not speculate. I think I've seen a lot of problems that officers have in depositions with speculating because they like to have answers to questions. They want to be helpful. And it's really hard for an officer to say, I don't know. But it's important for an officer to do that if that indeed is the answer to the question. And if you don't remember as well, a lot of time elapses between when you've written a report, when something occurs, and when you've written the report, which is hopefully that same day, and when a deposition occurs. That's why you have the reports, is to help you remember. But sometimes there are things and specific questions that will be asked that are very detailed that you might not know or remember, and it is okay to say that you don't remember. People will understand that. It's also important, again, not to argue in a deposition, and it's important to, in the report, not to appear argumentative in a report. Really, the only job that an officer has during a deposition is to respond to the questions that are asked. It's not the time for us to tell our story. We don't want to educate the other side about our theories. It's their one and only chance to talk to you and get information that they need. There have been many times where a lawyer on the opposing side has not asked certain questions that when we've gotten to trial, they're not prepared on because they haven't asked the right questions. And it helped us and surprised them when we were able to explain certain things that they weren't ready to meet. One of the other things that's really crucial to remember about a deposition, and this will come across in your police report too and how you write things, is we lawyers are not only asking for information, but we are assessing you as witnesses. It will determine how we proceed with the case, how we think jurors will perceive you or the facts. So it's important to always be honest and to be likable. And if anyone has to be nasty, let the lawyer do it. Be yourself. And the caveat to that, unless you're truly a jerk, then we're going to have to spend a little bit more time in my office getting you prepared. But one of my favorite things that I've had officers do is to acknowledge if there was a mistake and to help someone understand maybe why they did the thing that they did. It really adds relatability and credibility. And it's important to go over that with your counsel beforehand or your supervisor before you do that in a report so that you do it in the right way. But it really changes the tone of everything. So I think that covers everything we have, and we're at our ending period. I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions or thoughts, or if you have any disagreements, please let me know, because I'm always learning with you and appreciate being educated by you. And I hope you have a fantastic spring, and we'll see you all well and soon.
Okay, Heather, I don't see any questions either right at the moment, but I was kind of curious myself. I was witness to an event recently, and someone asked me after the fact to write down details about it. And, you know, so that kind of goes along with what we were saying today. And I found that even just, you know, a matter of hours after the incident, how jumbled up things could get in my mind as far as the order of events, you know, exactly what somebody said. You know, do you have any advice on when is the best time to, you know, record details so that you have, because sometimes right in the moment, you know, adrenaline could be going or something, and that may not be the best time to record all the details or to write your report. You know, is there any advice as to, you know, what kind of time frame and ideas on how to make sure we get our facts as close to accurate as possible? Because, you know, what we remember does change, you know, over time, you know, who said what and when they said it and how they said it and our perception of how they said it. So any recommendations?
I think it's a great question, Doug. And I think it is a multiple-pronged answer. My recommendation would be to write down the information, especially if it involves a lot of adrenaline, right then. Details that you can. Start that with police report and everything. Do a you know, just a, I don't want to say a word vomit, but, you know, just everything, because that's when it's going to be freshest in your mind, but you don't complete it at that time. And then maybe give yourself an hour or two to process things, because it will, things will come back to you, a little bit of clarity will come back to you. So you've gotten really the details of that down, and then you can come back and provide a little bit of the, I think what happens over that time period, and it depends on what you're dealing with and how much intensity there is, but it will help provide a little bit of perspective because you'll start thinking yourself about, why is it that I did that, and how was it that I thought that person acted this way, and then you'll have a little bit of clarity, and you'll remember additional details as well. So I think there will be some perspective that comes as to why and how, and then there will be some details that you didn't catch in the minute that as you're thinking about it, you recall. So like I said, I think it's that multiple pronged thing. Get what you can down immediately. Don't finalize it. Give yourself a little bit of time to process it. And it all, of course, a shooting is going to be very different in terms of how you go about doing it. But there are a lot of times, you're in a foot pursuit, and there's a lot of adrenaline involved. Jot that stuff down, or type it down, or dictate it quickly, and then when you go back and you write the full report later, do it a little bit later with more perspective, and I think you will find that additional details will come to light as well.
I've noticed in the past, I've heard other people talk about this subject, and they will mention, that we want facts, 5 senses, facts. What did you see, hear, feel, smell? And I've heard people say avoid opinion, but I like the way you also talked about, don't just say what you felt, but why you felt. What are the facts that, caused you to feel that way? How do we approach, that opinion and feeling, versus, documenting actual hard facts? Is there certain, statements of opinion that we should avoid? Or should we, be able to explain opinion with facts?
Well, things such as, I thought the man was truly a horrendous person and deserved to die. It's not something we would want to see, and not an opinion we would want to see. But it is helpful to say that he looks rather hardened, I think is perfectly appropriate, and then have facts that explain that. There were these tattoos in these places, and based on my training and experience, it means this. So I actually like to see very, very modest opinions in there that help the people to understand what it is, just not really inflammatory opinions, if you could think about it that way.
Okay, super. I still don't see any specific questions.
Doug, question.
I see a question mark. I don't see the question.
It looks like we have a question. It says, I realize this is a little off subject, but how do you feel about the officers reviewing body dash camera footage before writing or making a statement in OIS? I know that my advice is criticized sometimes, but I always allow them to do that. I think by not allowing them to do that, you're setting them up to have inconsistencies, because what someone may perceive is, especially in a stressful situation, may be very different than what is shown. And why would we want to set the officers up to be inconsistent with what a video shows? The other reason why is that it might help bring to light some of the details that they might not otherwise remember. When they watch it again, they might think, oh my gosh, I remember this is what happened. I'm seeing this is what happened, and this is how I felt about it, and this is why I did what I do. So I think it's important, and I would always advise officers to be allowed to watch any footage that there is before they give a report.
I've noticed, Heather, lots of times people will form an opinion based on, just what they see in the video, whereas that video has a fairly narrow, field of vision. And, I think it's also important to make sure that we're explaining what's going on out of the frame as well. Because I think often witnesses or jurors are going to look at that video, and that's the entire world for them, and it's maybe only, 60-degree field of vision. And we probably don't want to limit ourselves to just, you know, what we see in that recorded evidence. You know, we can have additional explanation.
That is why reports are just absolutely crucial. And I've tried cases where the body camera video either didn't show what was crucial to the officer's decision-making process, or really presented in a way that was not favorable, but once it was understood in the context of what the officer's report was, or in the instance of a shooting, verbal report, you know, interview was, are just absolutely critical. So it's really, really important to pay attention and detail to that. We have one other question here that says, but what about Graham versus Connor? And I'm assuming that goes to allowing officers to review reports, body camera footage before having them appear at an investigation interview. I'm not sure I understand that. Graham versus Connor really just focuses on the reasonableness of an officer's use of force, and that the test under the Fourth Amendment is the totality of the circumstances. There's a subsequent case where, I think it's the Scott versus Harris case, where a plaintiff tried to create a fact dispute, as I was talking about with one of my cases, and there was video of the incident that showed something different, and the court concluded that what is shown on the video, you know, if it's not subject to further explanation, cannot create an issue of fact. And so it's really important to do that. I'm not sure what the question about Graham v. Connor in relationship to the body cam review of the body camera is. I think what it can do is be augmented. So when the officer reviews that, I've had instances in shootings where officers have been allowed to review it before they go in for investigation, and instances where they have not. And I will tell you that in the instances where they have not, it's been a lot more complicated and difficult when a claim comes to light, because what an officer sees and perceives in a very stressful event can be very inconsistent with what is shown. And if the officer can see it from the perspective that the camera is showing, they can be able to understand what maybe they did or didn't see. Maybe there are very human phenomena that brains fill in details based on our personal experiences and our level of stress that didn't actually happen. And it can help them to see that maybe that is what is happening in that instance. And so that the answer to a question, instead of being a definitive, I fired 3 shots, when the officer really fired 12 shots, maybe, I don't know how many shots I fired. I remember firing 3, but it could have been more, if that's an example.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Heather, so much. We appreciate your time and your expertise. And again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. And I know Heather's open to people reaching out to her as well. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you the next time around.
Hey, Doug.
Yes.
Just remember to